Let's move to Brazil because Jair Bolsonaro, the 38th president who ruled from 2019 to 2023, is under house arrest right now, looking at the prospect of spending the rest of his life beyond bars. The 70-year-old former army captain turned right-wing politician was convicted yesterday of plotting a coup and attempting to assassinate the current president, Lula da Silva. It's been a sensational case with several of his entourage and military officials also in the dock, and predictable too, given the avalanche of evidence against him and key associate turned whistleblower in the case too. He calls it a witch hunt, and significantly so does his friend President Trump. The US Secretary of State Marco Rubio is also threatening to respond, quote, accordingly, what he called an unjust political persecution by the Brazilian authorities, including the Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes, who the US accused of being, quote, sanctioned human rights abuser. The sanctions come from Washington. So some incredible twists and turns in this affair with profound implications for Brazil. Let's bring in Anthony Pereira in London, professor specialising in Brazilian politics, democracy, human rights at King's College and director of King's Brazil Institute. It is great to have you on the programme this evening, Professor. First of all, you've spent a long time looking at this case. In your view, how watertight is it? How clear is the evidence against Jair Bolsonaro?
Oh, thanks for introducing me. I should say I'm no longer the director of the Brazil Institute at King's, but I'm a visiting professor there.
Noted.
Yes, I think the evidence, if you go back to November of 2024 and read the two federal police reports about the coup plot, there's a lot of very strong evidence that Jair Bolsonaro was trying to get members of the armed forces to support him in not handing over power to President Lula. So that's why I think, as you said, it wasn't that surprising that the verdict has come in and that he's been found guilty by 4 of the 5 judges in the Supreme Court. So I think that part was sort of expected. I think one of the interesting things is now what Jair Bolsonaro is going to try to do politically, because he may be ruled out now as a candidate for the 2026 election, but people are expecting him to endorse a candidate or to take a position in this upcoming race. And it's not clear exactly which way he's going to go.
It's a very good point, Anthony. And actually, I do wonder what you think this does to the base, because he has this huge support, doesn't he? They call him Mito, the legend. It's kind of a worshipful following. But those within, I mean, is there across the board, is there a support for him? Are we starting to see figures coming out, trying to make their own path, kind of distancing themselves from Bolsonaro on the right?
Yeah, that is starting to happen. So an example of that would be Eduardo Leite, governor of Rio Grande do Sul. He's not a supporter of Lula. He wants Lula to be defeated in 2026, but he is accepting the verdict and he's distancing himself from Bolsonaro. Not all politicians on the sort of right side of the spectrum are doing that. Tarcísio de Freitas in Sao Paulo is saying that if he were to be elected, he would amnesty Bolsonaro. So I think this issue is going to carry on into the 2026 election. And it's really a decision, I think, for the opposition to Lula is whether they want to embrace this verdict and say that they agree with it and that they're constitutionalists, or whether they adopt the narrative that President Trump himself is adopting and his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and they say, this is a witch hunt, this was unconstitutional, this was unfair, and so on.
What strikes me in just listening to the kind of state of the moment in the US, listening to the governor in Utah talking about this being an absolute pivotal moment in the direction of the US, and if we reflect on the situation in Brazil right now, I just wonder whether you think this is a point to which you are worried that it could appear the supporters could flood the streets of Bolsonaro. How do you see things playing out in the coming days and weeks?
Yeah, I think there are similar risks in the two countries of polarization spilling over into violence. I think that's why the upcoming decision, the legal decision about where Bolsonaro would be, where he would serve his sentence, is quite consequential. His lawyers will probably ask that he be able to remain in house arrest. And from the point of view of the Lula government, that might be a better outcome than actually sending him to a prison cell, as was done with President Lula when he went to prison for about 18 months between 2018 and 2019. The reason that might be preferable for the Lula government is that it's less likely to bring people onto the streets for his base to see him as a martyr, and it would be the status quo of what we have now. But I think that is a good point that you're raising, and the base is going to carry on with this narrative. I think that this was an unfair and political and biased judgment.
And the connection still with his son, Eduardo, that connection with Steve Bannon, the friendship between them. I also want to talk about the courts in this, because there's been a lot of genuine concern more generally about the power of Brazil's courts, the way they work, who can bring cases, and whether there is overreach more generally. And I think that takes us to perhaps the bogeyman for the right alongside the current president is Alexandre de Moraes. Tell us about him. He's faced death threats. He's the target in an assassination plot that I mentioned, but he also faces US sanctions.
Yeah, I think the country is very split on Alexandre de Moraes, the way it is generally on Lula as well. I think there's, close to half the population doesn't trust the Supreme Court, and Alexandre de Moraes, about half, little over half, does. He probably has overreached in the past. He was very aggressive at closing down certain social media accounts in Brazil, especially during the election of 2022. I think what's important to remember, though, is that some of these actions were not related purely to freedom of speech and people coming up with opinions about politics. There was this attempt to subvert the elections and to overturn the transition to the elected government of Lula. So that's something I think is insufficiently appreciated outside of Brazil. But I think even people who applaud the conviction of Bolsonaro and think that the Supreme Court acted wisely in this case, some of them would still also prefer to rein the Supreme Court in a bit and have it be less of a protagonist in Brazilian democracy going forward.
When we look at the situation as to what could happen next with the US, with a response being threatened from Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, we are yet to see what it is. There's already 50% tariffs. It's trying to understand what is your view on whether what the motives are here, and whether it's simply that it's a right-left issue. There's been previous clearly with President Lula and President Trump, and a kind of pivot towards China for many years for Brazil. What do you think is at the crux of US political positioning right now?
I think a lot of it has to do with Donald Trump seeing in Bolsonaro himself, seeing the travails that he had after the insurrection in 2021 in Washington, D.C. And so he very much identifies with Bolsonaro. I think one interesting question is, how far is Trump going to push his support for Bolsonaro? Because now that Bolsonaro has been convicted, and this looks like a sort of definitive legal judgment, Trump is famously transactional. Might he simply think, well, this guy has lost judicially, he's lost politically, he's no use to me anymore. There's no point in me pushing this. And there's very little area to go once the tariffs are up to 50% and the sanctions have been placed on the 5 Supreme Court justices. So I'm not sure that Trump has the stamina to continue to support Bolsonaro, although his son, Eduardo Bolsonaro, certainly hopes he will. And he's saying that there will be further retaliations from the U.S. side, but it's hard to know what those will be. There've been very few specifics about what the Trump administration intends to do in reaction to this, what is clearly a domestic judicial case.
It leads me to a brief point about, whilst there's kind of instability diplomatically, given the pressure from the most powerful country in the world to President Lula, what's the result in terms of his popularity? Is he seeing a bounce in the polls?
He did see a bounce, yes, a small one, but he saw a bounce in his popularity. I think the fact that he's seen as defending Brazilian national sovereignty has helped him politically. Equally, on the other side, the fact that Bolsonaro seems to want to damage Brazil's interests, his economic interests, in order to save his own family and personal political interests has hurt him politically. I saw an interview with General Cruz, who had served in the cabinet of Bolsonaro in his term as presidency, and Cruz was baffled why Eduardo Bolsonaro would be, trying to get the Trump administration to hurt Brazil economically through these tariffs. And as a nationalist, he thought that was not a good thing to do. So yes, we don't know if this bounce that Lula has received from this case will carry on into the 2026 election, because that's a long way away. That's October of 2026. But he seemed to benefit, at least up to now, from this confrontation.
Great to talk to you this evening. Thank you, Anthony. Anthony Pereira, professor specialising in Brazilian politics, visiting professor at King's College, also director of the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Centre in Miami. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.